How are you all? Thank you. Thanks for coming on a cold, sunny, and beautiful morning. I am a lazy person and I did not send my bio to somebody to introduce myself, so I will do the job myself. My name is Vibha. I am an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies in the School of Cultural and Critical Studies at Bowling Green State University, and my work focuses on migration. I am originally from India, came here about 30 years ago to study at Michigan State University. You guys know what's been happening there. And then instead of going back, stayed on and got a job here, and I've been here since my 20th year, I think. So this is home for me. And so today's talk, and I focus on migration. My migration study is based on professional migration. I focus on gender, especially how men and women migrate differently. And I also look at households, you know, how decisions are made, but I also look at areas of where migrant settlements, why do migrants come to a particular area? And my study focuses on metropolitan Detroit, and I look at why in 1970s, 80s, when Detroit is declining, is one of the, you know, in terms of economically, one of the worst places to be in the USA. Many migrants are coming here. And what is the reason? So I focus a little bit more on the political economy. So I want to thank, along with you all, Deborah, for organizing this. This is, I think, my third or fourth time I'm here, and I love coming here because the questions you ask and the interactions I have been really, really wonderful. In fact, I have some more ideas regarding what to do with Senior Center, and I was talking to Deborah about that. So today's talk is, in some ways, a sort of a negative has a negative context, right? It's about climate change and climate refugees. This is a new field of study that, you know, we didn't really talk much about. I first came across this in early parts of my career here when I was teaching about refugees, and I was talking about Dadaab. Have you guys heard of Dadaab? It's the largest, it used to be the largest refugee camp in the world. It's in Kenya. It has now 4 refugee camps, and its population is more than 250,000, and yet it's still a camp, not a city. So think of that. And every year, and there are 4 camps. The camps Dadaab emerged as a result of the civil war, and there were 4 areas, so 4 camps. But the 4th camp that began in late 1990s was a result of climate refugees. That was my first introduction. And I didn't really understand, what is happening. And then I had a friend from Ethiopia as a grad student who kept saying, they are not focusing on the main reason for this. He says they're talking of development, but the development is not right. He says every 10 years we have more famines than droughts. So he says in terms of planning, he says globally people were not thinking properly, because he said if you keep having cyclical droughts, there is some problem. Something is not working out. And so since then, I just sort of look at it here and there, and I try to make connection between my area of study of migration, where people voluntarily migrate, where people choose to think rationally and then make decisions based on rational decisions, and then make the move. So it's what we call mobility, upward mobility. But for climate refugees, there are 2 kinds. The reading talks about it, right? One is the sudden onset, a cyclone happens, or something happens, an earthquake, and people are forced to move, right? And the other is the slow onset. And the slow onset is what was happening in Ethiopia, in Somalia, or what is now happening. It's come home, right? When we talk about what's happening in Lake Mead, Lake has just disappeared, right? We are talking about all these dams that were constructed on Colorado River, and the water level is so low, right? So it is slow onset, and we never imagined this thing would happen, right? So it's come home for us. So I am going to begin with some foreboding news, and the news is, it came out last week, and I'm just going to read this news report. And this is, the head of the United Nations has warned that rising sea levels caused by global warming could spur a mass migration of entire populations from low-lying areas on a biblical scale. Right? Speaking at the Security Council, what he says is, under any scenario, countries like Bangladesh, China, India, and the Netherlands are all at risk. Megacities on every continent will face serious impacts, including Lagos, Maputo, Bangkok, Dhaka, Jakarta, Mumbai, Shanghai, Copenhagen, London, Los Angeles, New York, Buenos Aires, and Santiago. I think missing in this is Miami, which is also safe, right? And what he says is, he talks about, the data and stuff, but what he says is, and some of the things that he talks about is, again, based on other reports that came out, floating ice around Antarctica just hit a record low. So that means global warming is reaching Antarctica, where ice is no longer there in the water that used to be there, right? The other report that came out was warming seas are carving into massive Antarctic glacier that could trigger sea level rise. And this is based on a scientific report where people scientists sent camera under the shield, the glacier, and were stunned at what they saw, right? They saw these, sort of new carvings based on water that is melting. And he says low-lying communities and entire countries could disappear. What he also said was the number of people forcibly displaced by war, food insecurity, and changing climate conditions, including severe drought, already topped 100 million in 2022. Think of that, 100 million until last year, right? Which is, and so what we are thinking about is nations are working on dealing with this, formulating new policies, how to deal with this new kind of migration that is occurring, right? And what is also what Guterres, the UN head, said was, the UN head has been battling to keep climate change at the top of the global agenda during a time of geopolitical upheaval. Last year, he warned the world was sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. And I repeat, sleepwalking to climate catastrophe as the coronavirus pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine undermined already lackluster efforts to meet global and national climate commitments, right? Add to this now what's happening in Turkey, right? So what we see is there's so much going on in the world that climate, anything based on climate and climate migration is at the back of our mind. So now the question is, how do I start talking about this? Is there any format you want me to do? Do you want me to give you a lecture, or do you want to focus on the questions that are at the back of this? I can talk. My students have, and I tell them, you have to stop me, otherwise I talk nonstop. You guys are not my students, so you have more control. Talk, okay, I can talk, but I'll move around. I don't like standing. I haven't prepared PowerPoint or anything. I just walk around and I talk. Is that okay?
Yeah.
You guys have read this, right? So I will use that as a basis of my conversation. And what I want is, I want you to stop me. If you have any questions, ask me, and let's go from there, right? So before I begin, you guys are my students. So let me ask you a question. What are the main points you found from this video? Two main points.
Can you take the microphone?
Oh, sorry. I guess I can't move. I guess I'm stuck here.
You can't go deeper.
Okay. So, what are the 2 or 3 main points you found that interested you, that fascinated you about this video? Anybody? Go ahead.
I saw a documentary and they were talking about Bangladesh particularly, and they said that within 10 years, 60 million people would be in the water. We saw what happened in Pakistan last summer. One part of Pakistan underwater, you can't live there.
You can't live there, right? And the number of people you're talking about is 60 million. Bangladesh is one of the most highly densely populated nations, right? And most of the people live near the delta, which is where their livelihood is based on that. And with the rising sea level and the rising amount of floods, plus refugees coming from Myanmar, the largest refugee camp right now is in Bangladesh. Right? And Bangladesh, what was interesting was, I'm sorry, this a little bit about 5-8 years ago, when Bangladesh started getting these refugees, it is one of the poorest nations in terms of GDP and GNP. Said we welcome them because they said we 30 years ago were refugees in various countries. They accepted us, and so we need to make sure that we give back. There is a lot of now resentment against, but what was interesting was 10 years ago, a country that is facing so many economic issues, right? One of the poorest countries was welcoming to refugees because of political situation in Myanmar, right? So what we see is, and as part of Pakistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is a huge province, under one beautiful places, new lakes opening up and lakes of overflowing. This is just two things. At the climate conference, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't remember the time, when US was sort of, and the developed nations were dithering what we need to do. A small nation, island nation in the Pacific said, we look to you for leadership. If you can't give it, please remove yourself so we can figure out a way. We are sinking, we are just drowning in this moment. Right? And that speech, one small nation speech, I don't remember the name of that, but it'll come to me a little later. But what we are seeing is globally, there is a new form of desperation. Because all of a sudden, people are seeing it on a daily basis. Their livelihood is destroyed. The nations are shrinking because the water sea level is rising. Right? So this is one thing. In Pakistan, what do? You see mass migration. Can a nation deal with that? In Pakistan, at the UN said, this is not our fault. In terms of global emissions of greenhouse gases, they said we produce so little. What is happening is these are developed nations produce, and you don't have borders for air and water, right? You have borders for people, and they say it's you have created a problem for us. What do we do? Right? So it's what they're talking in terms of the immediate problem, aid. But this is not a long-term solution. What is going to happen to these 60 million in Bangladesh and the other, many millions? And the reading talks about mega cities. Mega cities are, it's not just a metropolis, it's many metropolis combined together. And most of the mega cities are not in the developed world, right? They are outside the developed world. So what is the cities that I mentioned, Maputo, Mozambique, Lagos, in Nigeria, I think the only developed nation they talked about was Copenhagen, which is in Denmark, which is already in a low-lying area, or maybe Netherlands, which is already in a low-lying area. But majority of these mega cities are in areas where there is, in nations where the resources aren't there. And so what in my studies, in my classes, I ask students to connect local with global. These are areas where we need to think about how our actions are impacting somebody whom we've never met and probably will never meet, right? People of new nations. So air doesn't stop at the border. Air circulates wherever, right? Water doesn't stop. You might have a border, you might have a wall, but the water under and the airflow, there's no wall for that, right? So what I want you thank you for bringing that. You know, this in some ways is a good discussion point. Anybody else wants to say anything to that? So, any other point? That was just the first one. We spent 10 minutes on it.
There's a distinction here between natural changes in climate and those that are industrialized and induced. And I think we need to make a moral distinction between what is local problems. For example, the desert getting larger because of humans. The industrial carbon dioxide.
So that's very valid. The reason why climate change is producing what you said was more droughts. As the heat index is rising, more droughts are increasing. Water is drying faster, but then on the other hand, there's also sea levels are rising, right? So there's a sort of contradiction in what I'm saying. The different areas are experiencing climate change differently. But the second thing you are pointing out is a lot of climate change is a result of what we call industrialization and greenhouse gases, as people are talking about, and there's a distinction between that. But it's a distinction, but in reality, the two are connected. Right? So because of these greenhouse gases rising, the temperature, global temperature has been rising at a very high level. The UN, the convention said, let's bring it, let's keep it at a certain point so that they don't rise more than 1% or something. It hasn't happened. Right? So what we need is there needs to be a will to challenge some of these. And what we see in the reading is there is an understanding now. So I'm a newspaper hound. I read newspapers, many newspapers daily. I can spend hours reading newspapers rather than working on my research. But what I've been noticing in the past few years is climate change has become so important that newspapers have a section focusing on climate. Right? And so on a daily basis or weekly basis, there are news stories that focus on global issues and local issues. And the reading, the printout that I had were in those climate sections of just one of the newspapers that I subscribed to, so I can print it out, right? So what we see is there is new acknowledgement and new understanding that there is, and the stories that tell you are various kinds of stories. It's not just one story, it's what happened here, what's happening here, what's happening here, and trying to make connection, right? But what we are also, so there is a rising awareness, but there is limited action.
And resistance.
Resistance, not only limited action, but limited action is based on resistance. So the larger question is, how do we change this ideology, right? Among people who, among general population, that's the larger, the moral of the story. We need to make change, right? How do we change? As a nation, as how do we understand this? And secondly, how do we influence policymakers to make policy that is, in some way or shape, will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions or and also come with what to do with this 60 million people. Bangladesh doesn't have the capability to do that, right? Pakistan doesn't have the capability, right? Yet they didn't do anything that created the cause for this migration. So what do we do? So resistance,
local. You said that twice. I think it needs to start from the bottom. The resistance is at the top. It's a factor of money. Locally, you start working, and then locally, when someone that is in trouble.
excellent, we need to think locally, right? But let's look at the extent. Locally, we can at Bowling Green, we can look at what's happening to their Portage River, or university towns always are looking at our neighborhoods, or neighborhood localities. We can look at what's happening in Finland, why Finland is getting all these floods. People who lived in Finland for 50, 60 years say it wasn't the case, it's happening more, right? They're talking in terms of development. I don't know much about it, right? But we can think about it locally. If the problem is big enough, what happens when Bangladesh, I'm going to use Bangladesh and Pakistan, which are, part of South Asia, and I'm originally from India, as I said, so I know a little more. What do we do with these people, right? The extent of this problem is so big that even if you all are from the village, you have been knowing for 2 years, 15 years, that water levels are rising. Did anybody listen to you? If the nation listened to you, does the nation, what do you do? Because it's such, the problem has such high magnitude. What do we do? What are the solutions? Right? And the UN climate change and the international IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, has been saying we need to control the temperatures rising. Well, right. Does anybody listen? Who listens? That will is there. That resistance is there.
Something that just keeps going through my mind is something about the tandem model. And that even children, everyone can understand this is plant a tree. To plant trees, and there you brought up 25, and there are all these farmlands. I mean, the other day, all of them are telling, I think you were familiar there. It gets more than 100. And I would buy up that land and tree on it.
It's
Roll down and put more cement and more. Penetrate children, really.
so in India, we were doing that because there was so much deforestation. There was talk about planting it, right? We didn't plant it, but there was talk about it for the school, plant a tree, everybody would be around there, a few trees. And I think locally schools are doing a really good job of introducing. But then it's interesting you mentioned 25, because a couple of days ago when I was reading this this 25 came to my mind. When I moved here, the chair of my department used to live in Toledo, did not drive 75. He says, I will drive down the country road. He used to call it the car road. He said it reminded him of, he had spent his childhood in Italy. He said he would remind him, he said, even though it was flat, the greenery reminded him of countryside that he loved. And now it's an urban jungle. That's what it's emerging. So the urban heat index that the reading talks about is probably going to decrease, right? But in some ways, what it also shows is the contradiction. All these businesses we talk about, when we talk about economic progress, we talk about, new businesses, economic. Ohio, we know what are these businesses that are coming here. Some of those are auto related businesses, all the franchises of auto, companies have taken over some of the area next to Bowling Green. But if you come from Pettysburg, what you see are these nurseries or landscaping business. And that landscaping business in Northwest Ohio is one of the largest in the nation. Ohio is becoming, somebody told me works with and so I'm linking it to the other part of my research is on undocumented people. Why undocumented people? Migrant workers come here. It is this new nursery business. Right? So think about the growth. Somebody told me Ohio is the third largest. Don't quote me on this, but Ohio is the third largest producer or supplier of nursery-based plants and trees nationally. I I could be wrong, but I vaguely remember somebody saying that, somebody who's in the business. So all the, and so if you see the development, it is all this based on nursery base, we all spend so much time beautifying our garden, right? So nurseries, Ohio is a flat land, we want to bring color to our lives, so so what we see is development versus, and there's job creation. If this is tax base. And then the tension between, if you go and talk to the Wood County commissioners and say, don't do that, their yardstick for doing well is based on business related. So what we need to do is we need to think about how do we, if we are increasing the urban need index, right? In urban areas, bringing more cemented area, we need to bring more plants, not cut plants. So each one can start with this, planting a tree. But how much, so locally that might improve, but globally, how much would that improve? The greenhouse gases. But there is a solution. So what we are doing is we are collectively thinking of a solution. And the solution in some ways might contradict our perceptions of what is economic growth. Am I making sense? Anybody else?
I don't know that there's any real good place for this. Everything we talked about so far, there seem to be other factors. There is one classic case of migration involving only climate. And it should be, in fact, I'm disappointed it wasn't before. And it's a very studyable case because it's so clear cut. In the year 900, temperature in the region increased over just a few decades to about 23. And then about 1300, it decreased to 23. There must have been a change in the Gulf Stream. But it happened rapidly, existed for 300 years, and then back down to where it was originally. So what happened in this period of time?
I have no idea.
Yes, you do.
I have no idea. I know about 19th century, 20th century.
The great explorers, they discovered this place that had gotten warmer. So they settled it, they colonized. So they were the native people.
So they colonized it, and as a result of colonization, what happened? The temperatures rose or declined?
There's no reason to quantity. Temperatures rose during a climate factor period. There was nothing else.
So what you're saying is something will happen now in within 300 years from 21st century to.
Well, my point is that were to happen, then it would really fit this topic. There's no migration and climate change. So what happened then in the year 1300? And the climate got 20 degrees colder. Well, you knew it, so we went better adapted to that environment. It's out today. If you go to Greenland today, 90% of the population isn't doing it.
I have no idea. I am not even going to venture here. I do 19th and 20th century migration. Honestly, I don't know. I'm going to go explore.
There were no other factors. That's all fine. Nothing else.
But the question is, why did
Probably all.
I'm not even going to venture into that. I have no idea, right? I'll make a fool of myself. Okay, right? So what we've been talking about right now is, thank you, because now I'm going to go and look at that. So the question to now I've been focusing on is there is something happening across what we call climate, in relation to climate temperature rise, which is increasing migration, right? So the second question I want to focus on is who migrates? What happens when people who choose? Not everybody migrates. If there's a catastrophe, yes, people will migrate. But normally, if there's a slow onset, people will pick and choose, not everybody migrates. So who will migrate? And migrate, when we talk about, the reading focuses on migration and displacement. Right? So migration in some ways is related to mobility. I chose to migrate from India to here, for multiple reasons. The reasons when I entered USA and the reasons 20 years later, or 10 years later, and 20 years later, and 30 years later are different, right? Each is related to your lifestyle at the time and your expectations of life at the time, which change over time. So in some ways, this was a conscious decision. It was a gradual decision. And it also, the fact that I was educated, it helped me with the hurdles of what we call the walls. The wall at this time I'm talking about is the immigration policies, right? Which have become very selective. And so it's like I could fulfill the criteria that, the US, the nations have enforced. So what happened? So conscious migration is based on multiple factors. It is long run, it is gradual, right? I thought for a year I wanted to come and study here. I amassed resources. Migration is very expensive, right? And I tell my students coming to USA, I had to show certain funds. You don't get visa. I have to show funds. I have to show them evidence that I will come back to, India. I had to get a passport. Getting a passport in India wasn't easy. It's not like US where you just go and get it, right? I had to think about how do I amass $40,000 to equal of $30,000, right? So you have to, the cost of a plane ticket. In USA, if you travel across, to Europe or someplace, it's less than 1 month straight. The cost of fare when I was coming was close to a year's salary for me, and I was a professor in English, right? So it's like I had to think, how do I save money to come to the US? So migration, it is well thought out. I also had resources here, what we call networks, social networks. I had family, I had friends who guided me when I was in India and who helped me out. Not monetarily, but in terms of passing on information, what to do, what not to do. Historically, that has been the case, right? If somebody, how many of you are migrants or your families are migrants? Everybody is a migrant. Anybody remembers the stories their parents told them? Would they speak the language when they came here?
You didn't read English, or German?
And then what happened? How did they get jobs?
They had dance and almost here and set them up.
So what we see is there are these what we call social networks that help them, right? You could be an Italian who came here. You were, they were constructing the canal here, and you would be, you came and stayed with me. I was the supervisor. I was like, another person has come here. You start digging. You don't need English. You just needed skill, right? And this is our lack of skills. You're just digging, having a good body. So most of the migrants who migrated initially were men, young men. Individuals are part of family, and family usually makes decisions who migrates, who doesn't, right? So what we also see is there is a gender division in migration. Usually men are seen as workers and they are encouraged to migrate. Women, very limited number of women migrated. But what we see is those who migrate because the job in the destination nation are also based on gender, right? Women migrants who came from Ireland worked in domestic service, right? And then there rose up, the next following generations rose up. Italians didn't like their women working, but the Italian women also work at home. They work on the, the pieces, in the textile industry, whatever they could do at home, they would do at home. So what we see is there is social networks are central to settlement. The decisions where you go or where you don't go is also based on the story, right? Like I always tell the story, and I'm sort of digressing a bit, but I need to tell you the story. One of my work is based on ethnographic work. My research is based on ethnographic work. And I talked to somebody who came from India. He was an engineer. And he said in 1960s or early 70s, everybody was migrating. And he says, from my company, people were migrating. He said, I had a good job, but he said, I had to think of my kids and life there was better. Life in India didn't seem to be better. Right? In terms of what they could get, bigger houses, cars, things that were luxury in India for part of life here. So he said there's no Google there. There's no, there's very few telephones, there's telegraphs. He said, my friend encouraged me to come here. He says, I landed up in New York City. And he said, then I went to his house. He said, nobody came to pick me up at the airport. I went to his house. He said, he told me. He said he hadn't got my information that I was coming. And he had moved to Detroit. So he says, I had $8 or $10. He said, I took a Greyhound and came to Detroit. He says, I was there crying, standing at the bus station and just thinking, what have I done? Left my job, left my, wife and kid back home. What am I doing? He said, I had no idea where to be. And he says, in downtown Detroit was a different Detroit at the time. He said, somebody came and said, what are you doing here? Like, tap on his shoulder, and what are you? He said, I had my one suitcase, and I was just thinking, what's the next step? He said he worked in the same company as I was working. And because this was an automotive company, everybody ended up in Detroit. So he said he wasn't my friend, but I knew him. He said he took me home. And he said there were 3 or 4 more people from the same company who were living in this apartment. And he said they knew where my friend was. They contacted him, and he said, I lived with those people for a few days. And they told me there's a job here. He says, I didn't get an engineering job, but I got whatever job I got, the level low. He says, I took it. And then he says, finally, when I got a job, I took an apartment in the same building. There was a community. Right? And then he says, I got my wife, and within a year, wife and family. So what I'm trying to say is social networks are central to migration. But what about these climate refugees? Don't have any network. If there's a drought happening every year, you make a change. Right? You start thinking about it, where to go. But if it's like something happens overnight, the cyclone, a hurricane, an earthquake, what do? Your livelihood is gone. And so what is happening is most of this migration is internal migration within nations. And people are just moving because there's nothing. But what the reading says is not everybody moves. Families make decisions. Who will move? And usually it's the men who go first, find jobs. Right? And then they bring the older people who don't want to move. Right? There is attachment to locality. There are cultural reasons. Our ancestors are very here. Right? We need to be here. And so people, what we call rational decision making, is very subjective. Again, I'm not using, I knew a family from Mexico in the Cleveland area. Farm workers. One of the elders died. They hadn't been in Mexico in 25 years, but they wanted to bury his body there. In Mexico, where they found him difficult. It was costing them this 10 years ago, $6,000 to transport the body. They got the money. They collected the money. And while paying the funeral home, additional charges for keeping the body there. Because it was so important that he be buried with his ancestors. Right? So people make decisions, and migration is not easy. In one of the books that I always talk about, and I want everybody to read that, Brother Undying. Right, in Antarctica, one of the person who doesn't move, who has opportunities to move, who says migration is an exile. Why would I leave my church? You know, the community of that. He's also a pastor. Why would I leave this community of my people and move to the US? Right, so migration is an exile. It's between familiar and unfamiliar. Territories, but what we see, what is happening increasingly is people are migrating as nations are becoming more. A majority of the migration is internal migration, so there is pressure on local governments. Think of Bangladesh, think of Pakistan, think of India. You know, certain parts of India get flooded every year. So what do we do? What do nations do? And most of these things are happening in nations which do not have the capability to take care of their people. So the question is, can the nations can't do it themselves, but there is increased migration, 100 million, right? And some of these people also migrate across borders. Like I said, Bangladesh has a lot, it's not the continent, but Kenya, Antarctica, and it's 250 people, 250,000 people. UNHCR helps them. And most of these people are not categorized as refugees. People who are displaced. So to be categorized as a refugee and get some aid, you have to be certified by UNHCR. Right? So in Dada, if you read books, you know, there are lines outside these barbed wires, barbed camp, and people come in the morning and then they say, you know, who needs most? So it's once they are in, then you get some kind of benefits from UNHCR. You are registered as a refugee. So otherwise you become remain a displaced person. Right? So and UNHCR doesn't give, you know, if you read books on Dada or any kind of refugee camp, or just go to UNHCR website. There are schools there are shops there are places there. People have tried to make little homes in the areas where there were camps, you know, where there are abandoned. The majority of these people will not get jobs in Kenya or in Bangladesh because the nations only want their own people to get jobs. Right? So what we see is the number of displaced people is increasing, but our recognition of them as people or as refugees based on climate change remains limited. Right? So the third part of this, our reading focuses on policy initiatives. Right? And what they say is it's still, there is going to be huge investment to resettle people. Right? Think about what happened after Katrina. Think about what happened, you know, after what's going to happen. When new studies coming in Istanbul, or you know, it was Istanbul, that 55% of the buildings do not need to be cold, or you know, earthquakes and buildings. So what needs to be done? What can we do? And so, do you have a solution? You talked about locally. You talked about each one doing something individually, right? Planting their trees so that you know, in some ways, taking away the effect of large industrial effects of greenhouse gases, right? But can individual planting of trees compare with what is being daily produced by big industries? That's a question we need to think about.
I think we don't do anything because it sounds so overwhelming.
That's like, oh my God.
Yeah, that's hard, you know, I think about a huge migration too is out of Ukraine. And you were speaking about the older people, and I saw a documentary on television, and they were interviewing, and the older people are staying. And you know, maybe, you know, and they're saying ruined buildings, but you know, they probably think their life is pretty much played out, and they want to maybe die where they're, you know, where they're trying to, you know. But that's a massive migration. And I wonder how many of those people will really ever go back. But that's a whole other story.
This is also an example of overnight. Actually, but this is based on politics, you call, right? It has nothing to do with the climate. But think of what happened in Haiti about 10 years ago. There was a huge earthquake. And then there's this really good photo of the palace, the presidential palace, it's pancaked. You probably have all seen this. If you presidential palace, pancakes. What happens? Go Google that. It's a phenomenal photo in terms of it tells you the magnitude. What do you do? And Haiti in some ways. This is my personal belief, and I should have that in India, you believe in the philosophy of karma. Right? Your actions, previous actions, or previous life shape your life. Yeah. What if patience is there? And God is just punishing them.
I can't hear you.
I used to thinking, what would be patiently wrong that God is punishing them? Hurricanes, earthquakes. You know, so this is my view. That's why I do. Yeah.
Following up on her question. This is maybe more of the point. The Ukrainian, the other ones they're leaving, where are they going?
Where do
I
you
just talked to a woman from Lima, Ohio, and she's in with the church, and she has kind of adopted this family. And so I said, well, do you think they'll ever go back? And the children are in school, they're learning the language, and they probably will. And I would bet you that happened. I mean, those Ukrainians are going to Poland, and they're, and I would, it's gonna be hard for them to leave.
Majority of them are not in the US. Majority of them are in neighboring countries. It is Poland, it is Romania. That is where they are.
There's so much we-
So yeah, something, but in some ways where the trains came, right? They're migrating the trains. The train network takes them to Eastern Europe. That's where the majority of them. Or people were driving where the roads were. Northern borders are, Belarus, I think. Northern borders are not secure, it's the western borders, and there are a majority of them. US, what we don't realize is there's so much hue and cry about refugees in the US, but what we don't realize is US intake of refugee globally is minuscule. We take, I think, 25,000 refugees annually. By that, so it's, there is sometimes there is a special category, which allows refugees, certain basis.
This family had a
Relative, right.
So that certainly.
Yeah, so very few refugees coming to the USA, although we talk a lot. Right, there is like all our resources are just going to it, but if you look at it, there's a paltry amount that is paid to a refugee. So what they're doing is like what Canada started doing a few years ago with the Syrian refugees. They said, the government came up with this estimate. It cost this much money to settle a family of four. So people got together, put up their resources, that gave evidence to the government that we would like to sponsor a family. And that's what happened. And I have been reading recently that Biden administration is thinking along the same lines. Right? So in some way that is good that if you, or if you're, whoever supported a family, that in some way there's a personal connection.
Getting involved. And she helped them with all their paperwork. She says it's really hard. There's a point that's here and a point that's there.
What we don't realize is coming to America is getting connected to bureaucracy,
Yes, yes.
filling papers, right?
They seem to make it especially hard. They seem to do it deliberately.
It's not deliberately, there's a, rationale for it. But the thing is, for people who don't speak English, it is problematic. Right? For everything you get. And when they come here, the tickets that they, the US government buys their ticket, but that's on loan. The money you get as a refugee, you only get it for 2 years. they take back that money. It's cut every month. So it's not that you are, the US government is paying. The US, and then it gives you certain, for 2 years, it gives you certain amount of money. And I work with the local refugee, us together in Toledo. And what they say is, if it's a family of 4 coming, she says, we know we can afford. If you all get $900, we can afford to pay rent. But if it's a single person coming, she said on $900 or $1,000, she said, we can survive. You can't get your own apartment. So I know in the past, Corinne has looked for around University of Toledo, where there are students looking for one individual, and she houses them. Plus, to get a rent in an apartment, you need a credit history, right? You need a bank account. You need to show them that you can pay. The landlord doesn't care whether you're a refugee or not, right? So there are these other factors that you don't even think about. And so they create hardship, right? So, did I answer your question? Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
When a migrant goes into a camp, do they do anything more than take their name and names of their children? Are they interviewed for their skills? Can they speak English? What was their occupation? Does any of that happen?
I don't know how the intake is, but my sense is it's based on hardship, not your skills, right?
But America has areas where we need workers. A company could sponsor an engineer or a line worker at a factory making cars.
Germany is doing that. With the Syrians, they did that, they trained them, and they looked at that. Here in Ohio, they're also doing that. So I don't know if you know, Ohio, there is this nationally anti-immigrant bill, yet Ohio is buckling the trend in some ways. Ohio cities, what they're doing is, as the population is declining, they want migrants to come and settle. Because migrants, especially refugees, come with families. They make home here. They develop an area here. So I don't know if you're familiar with Welcome Baby. All Ohio cities have this initiative, Welcoming Immigrants initiative, right? In 2015, I think Toledo, Lucas County started this Welcome Toledo, Lucas County. Bowling Green has also started this initiative, but it's a very limited initiative in some ways, right? So what they are doing is the state of Ohio. So I went to one of these meetings in Toledo many years ago, and there were people who raised their hand, couldn't speak English well, and they said, we were truck drivers in Syria. We have driven all the trucks that you drive here. Make the test, driving test, translate it into Arabic. We can pass that, right? The road symbols and stuff. And what we saw was the Ohio, there was an agency for economic development. Their people were there. They were taking notes. This guy said, I have driven these trucks across Syria and Jordan. And he said, I know so many other people, but there was issue with language competency. Right? So they were taking notes. And now we know driver's license exam is in many languages. It's not just English, it's English, Spanish, and it depends on the state. So the US did that in 1948. So in 1948, the first Refugee Act is, there's after the Second World War, there is all these refugees. And so many of them, US develops a refugee policy. And in that refugee policy, to come to USA, there's a general, I'll generalize it, so there's a general line. So you apply for a status to migrate to USA in January 1st, 1947. You applied on January 2nd, you applied on January 3rd. So your application will move on the day it was submitted, right? So it's based on the time it was submitted. And it's on first come first basis. But the refugee law changed that. They said we need skilled people in the USA. And so what they did was 50% of the quota, I think, was based on your skills. So if you said, I work in a machine, you know, in the factory there, I'm a machinist of this thing, there was a separate line for that. You could come immediately if that was needed, right? So US since 1950s has a policy that all is needed, you know, skills are needed, you can come overnight. Right, and so what we see is in some ways, if you look at the, there's a long, but for refugees, they don't necessarily do that. Right, but this is a way how to bring some skilled refugees, but you know, this would sort of, women would not benefit from that.
I disagree. I mean, if a woman sews, she can go in and work in manufacturing.
There, you know, but culture plays a part. You know, some nations do not allow, some cultures do not allow women to get out, right? So we need to rethink refugee policy. We need to rethink policy where we start thinking about climate refugees. Right? How do we determine this is a climate refugee? How do we bring them here? Right? So in the US and many developed nations, migration has become a security issue. Right? So borders are becoming more and more militarized in some ways. Right? The southern border, not the northern border. They're becoming militarized. Same in USA. Hungary, in some ways, is very and there are other nations here, right? I'm just giving you one or two examples. So how do we deal with climate issues and people who are being displaced short term or immediately as a result of this you know, climate change? 100 million people. That's not a small number, right? And my students, when I talk about refugees, I say the majority of them will not leave that place. They will die as a refugee. The percentage of people who are settled is in single digits in percentage, right? So very few people will come out of their refugee status. And those who do are the lucky ones. Right? But then they'll carry the trauma in some ways. Right? So first is we see that the governments, the reading says the governments are only now realizing that there is an issue of displacement as a result of climate change. Policies are shaped for migration. Who can migrate, who cannot migrate, right? Policies are not shaped for climate refugees. How do we recognize these climate refugees, right? How do we develop a policy based on that? So there is a problem there. But the second thing the article talks about is they say solutions need to come from the bottom up, from the, you know, what they're talking about is industry needs to develop, right? Talk to local people. And what they're talking about is the Native American, Native tribes, and others are coming up with new results, new solutions that are not, you know, in Canada especially, the examples they give here, right? So we don't listen to local people in some ways. Right? Policy is shaped by negotiation in DC, where people from all states, who are facing or not facing. So the discourse in some ways challenges forming the things of policy. Right? But what the reading says is some industries have consciously chosen to deal with what, you know, with greenhouse gases or moving. The example they give is what's the Hewlett Packard? You know, in Houston is having huge floods in the past. So there, in 2016-17, I don't know what year is it, their headquarters of Hewlett Packard got flooded. So they are moved their headquarters to another suburb. Right? So there is an understanding among industries of what is happening, and they themselves are facing it. It's not that if they're producing greenhouse gases, that they will be they will not face these catastrophic issues. They are also facing it. So there is, solutions have to come from the industries in some ways. Solutions have to come from people in some ways.
It seems to me that a lot of the people in the United States just simply ignore the fact that there is climate change. They realize it's there maybe, but they don't want to recognize it. They're being an hostage and just hiding the fact that it is happening. And until they realize that, I think it's just talk and no action.
You are absolutely right, right? We are all thinking of how many of us think about climate change on a daily basis? Very few.
I do.
But what is the solution? So I think the solution, as you guys are proposing, is each one teach one. Right? Tell them about it, it's just creating an awareness, creating a knowledge. Solution will only occur when you realize there's a problem. If we don't see there's a problem, how can we even think about it? It's all
Climate change. How many of you know about this big dairy in Wood County? How many cows? 4,000 cows. Now, we're talking about climate change. You might say, what about Tom Harris? I'm a member of the High Farmers Union in Wood County. And you're saying, well, climate change? What is coming down the Maumee River? The watershed, the nutrients, the storm, when we get 4 or 5 inches of rain, where's the nutrients going? It's going into the Lake Erie. This is part of climate change. You know, I got a lot more information I'd like to say. What's that big aquifer south in Nebraska? What's the name of it? It's a huge aquifer out there. Well, I've used that as an example. We're drawing the water out of it, the farmers and the what? There we are. We're drawing it out, it's going down. It's part of climate change. We've got to address this, and I'm skipping around here, but one of the points is climate change is affecting the poor people, underprivileged people. They're not able to migrate.
absolutely right. So what you're saying is, it's not just Bangladesh, we are seeing changes in Wood County, right? A few of us who, we are urban people too. We just read the news. Rarely have we read news. So about these kind of issues. So what you're saying is locally, issues are impacting us. And we are seeing, and the second thing you said is, who can migrate, who cannot migrate? Poor people who live where they are. Right? They do not have the ability, the resources. The government doesn't help them because the government doesn't recognize it as a problem. So it is the poor, marginalized communities that further get marginalized, right? And the other thing you talked about was what's happening to the watershed. Remember a few years ago, about a decade ago, when Toledo shut down its water? 2014, shut down its water. That was my first introduction, but everybody knew. People locally knew what was happening. The algae bloom, right, as a result of all the chemicals that were coming through the watershed and going into Maumee River, into Lake Erie. So there is a new awareness now. Right? So what we see is there is an understanding among people locally. But it's even locally, how many of us knew that? So we need to spread the word. How do we spread the word? I think that is important.
Yeah, the grassroots, like you mentioned there. Mr. Grassroots.
It's a youth started grassroots movement, right? Each one locally and tell them. So what we are trying to do, Bowling Green State University in some ways has become the leader in this algae bloom. Yeah. They have a station in what's that island?
Seagate or not Sea.
What's the island across the?
Or Europe.
Cabins Island in Grass, right? They have a station there. I put somebody there once and I'm forgetting. So they are students, so you teach, make it part of the curriculum for students who understand, right? Who will hopefully spread the word. You have hands.
Yeah, we are who we were when. In other words, the average person in here, I'm gonna give you all ages, but your values were formed in the 50s and 60s. And we have a Congress that's, if we said you can't, if you're over 75, get out, we lose half of our Congress. We lose half of our senators. And those are people that are coming up with these policies because they had the values back then. There wasn't a concern about environment. There wasn't a concern about global warming. I mean, I didn't think of it when I was in the 50s and 60s. It was the least of our worries. And we said, you don't need any restrictions to come to the United States. Come on in, we need you. We had open doors. I don't even know if they had a test.
They had.
Well, it was a test. It wasn't that, not like it is today. And so maybe what we ought to do is, you said education is working. Maybe we ought to get some of these college students to run for office and get those others out. So that's what.
Again, a valid point, our agenda is based on our experiences, legislative agenda, right? And so if we are old and we are living in another world, we are not cognizant or refusing to believe, becoming an ostrich and not realizing there's a problem. So the solution you say is more young people running, who are cognizant of what is happening. And that's a good idea. Okay, the local people need to figure that out, right?
We're talking about solutions, and there are big solutions like electric cars and other, wind farms and all of that. Well, we can start in our own home by limiting how much meat and dairy that we consume. Animals are a big problem. It's not sustainable. They require a lot of water that is becoming a problem. And when the waste from those animals is bad also. A lot of crops are grown just to feed those same animals. And it would be a big difference if I'm not saying become a vegan tomorrow, but if we reduce the amount of animal products we use, it would make a big difference in climate change.
So again, we can be part of the solution. Small steps can happen.
On this planet just can't manage 9 billion people. And we're gonna be there pretty soon. And so there's gonna be wars over the resources, the water. And if we just build factories on this productive land where we're growing so many crops in this area, how are we gonna feed the people? And in other parts of the world too, like Ukraine.
Valid question. Tension between development and larger aims, right, of global change. Anybody else? So the final. What time are we supposed to? 11. Okay, so we have 20 minutes. Anyone want to say anything? So I'm going to come back to some of the things you said regarding migration open borders. There was no open border, but for Europeans, it's open border. So what happened is, what we don't talk about is, again, I'm going to give you a lecture. I do my students. Since the 20th century, late 19th century, after the Civil War, the US starts managing migrants, right? So a fledgling Bureau of Immigration is established in 1864 or so, 55. But it's a very small thing, and why it's done is established during Civil War is you need people to the land, because of the war, so. That is one act, so there's a tension always between who should come here, economic migrants, and what we call nationalist foreign policy. Who does the nation belong to? The people, do we want to allow people who look like us or who look different? And this tension is different. So in 1840s, you guys know that there is large scale migration that begins of the Irish people, and then migration from Europe. But there is a small migration on the west coast that is from Asia, Chinese start migrating. And they are like 3% or 4% of the total migrant population. In terms of US population, very limited. Yet we see local efforts to restrict that migration. 1875. So if the first act is bring people in for work as workers, second and seventh acts are to limit migration of people. So Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and only for a few years, a decade, and then it becomes permanent later on. Once the Chinese start coming, the Japanese start migrating, then you stop the Japanese too. And by in the early part of the 20th century, there is a movement that the US has too many immigrants, and these immigrants are resulting in America's decline. These are poor immigrants that, and there's also what we call a new science theory, eugenics. And so there are all these attempts to start a policy to end this migration. And most of the migrants, the Asians in 1970s, there is Asiatic Exclusion Act. So anybody from Asia is barred from migration, permanent settlement. They can come temporarily as visitors, as for studies, but not many people come, but they cannot migrate. So migration is only from Europe. But at the time, the largest group of people who were migrating from are Southern or Eastern Europe, who are not seen as genetically good people, right? The Teutons, the Nordic people, this is a race-based thing, are the best people. They will America great. So we need to bring the best people. That's the ideology. So in 1924, there is Johnson-Reed Act is passed, which establishes a quota based on who can come and from which nation. We talk about big data now. Big data happened at the time. What they look at is they look at the percentage of migrants who are coming from a certain nation, and they look at what we call stock and flow. Stock is what migrant stock you are from. And the census keeps data, huge data on that. Right now, my students are doing an assignment, just looking at 1910 data, and what they're stunned is how white race is divided in 4 parts. Right? So they can establish your stock. So let's say there are 4 kind of white people. So one is you were born in, and your parents were born in the US. Second is you were born in the US, but one of your parents was not born in the US. So that's a separate category. Third category is you were born in the US, but both your parents weren't born here. The fourth category is all of you were born abroad. But this is just white race, right? So what they're doing is they can find out statistically what percentage of migration, what's your blood, I don't want to use the word blood count, but what's your ethnic or your national origin? Are you Germans? Are you, from Belgium, from France, so they can figure that out. And so in 1924, a new Quota Act, National Origins Quota Act is established that looks at, it gives quota to each nation, right? It doesn't use the word race at all. But what it does is people from England have 60-some thousand people can migrate annually. Next, I think, is Germany. Third is Ireland, right? They have thousands. And then they want to ban or limit the Italians migrants because the Italians are part of the Mediterranean. And they said there's a lot of, they're one step ahead of the Africans because there's a lot of trade and a lot of intermixture happening. And so what they do is this data is based on migration, is based on census data. But census, the act takes place in 1924. But they look at, guess what census data do they look at? They could have looked at 1920, right? They could have looked at 1910. They could have looked at 1900. But this data is based on 1890 data. 1890 census data. Guess why? They did a limited analysis in 1921, there was an act, and they look, if you look at 1910 or 1920 there, a lot more Italians can come. Italian migrants start coming after 1880. So in 1890 census, there is limited. Right, so how data is first in some ways. And so it's based on this data of 1924 Act that migrants could come. So English people, and this migration data was good. England doesn't have all these people that they can send 60,000 people to migrate. We are talking about annually. So in 1940s, during the war, the new ideology starts coming. It's like, we need workers. You know, this data is not even getting fulfilled. So migrants were seen as a resource for national development. So if you were a worker, so in 1948, the Refugee Act is the first act in some way that looks at your skill. Otherwise, anybody could migrate, old, young, didn't matter. Whether you were a worker or not, didn't matter. So in 1940s, the idea starts changing. But the will to change the 1924 Act doesn't exist because the people are still, eventually, old people. Some of the people who were there in 1924 were still there. So in 1952, there is a limited act passed. That act establishes what we call H visa. Have you guys heard of H1?
Yeah.
H1, worker visa. So if you want to, and what it also does is it links economic development based on an industry. So it links it. So if you were running a factory in Bowling Green, let's say, and you needed 5 engineers, and you can't recruit those engineers, you've been trying, nobody wants to come in Bowling Green, right? You were a physician who, you were a local hospital that needs doctors, and nobody wants to come to Wood County Hospital. Wood County Hospital is always looking for physicians, right? Because they start here, and then within a few years they go to Toledo, they go to other metropolitan areas. So this H1 visa became what is known as a probationary visa. So you recruit a worker. You don't want to permanently bring somebody here. You don't want their stuff, right? You recruit them here. They work here for a few years, and then if you are a good worker, they can sponsor you to become a permanent resident, right? So this visa can only be renewed 3 times, so for up to 6 years. So within 6 years, you have to start the process, but your industry, your employer has to, right? So in some ways, it links the job needs to migration, right? So this happened but it wasn't making permanent because people who were there in 1924 didn't want to change this act. So 1924 Act lessens a few restrictions, and the Chinese and the Japanese people who had been there forever, they could become citizens. They could, and they could. But it's in 1960s, 1950s when a young generation is coming in the Congress, and the old generation is dying. That sets the basis for a new Immigration Act, what we call 1965 Act, right? That Act overturns 1924 Act because they say visa is not being fulfilled. And what the Act 1924 Act did was, there was nothing for economic migrants. There was nothing, it was very restricted. And so as US is developing after war, you need workers, you need scientists. So 1965 Act creates, in some ways, it's a family unification act, right? So if I was here, I could invite my family. And so out of 7 preferences, 4 are for family, but 2 are for economic. And there's a percentage for each group, right? For this many migrants, this criteria could be not more than 17%, not more than 10%, etc. One of the reasons for this was, in 1924 Act, all nations, irrespective of their race or something, were granted a visa of 100. But in 1950s, there was this huge refugee migration. Hungarians, the Greeks were coming. They have 100 migrants, yet thousands are coming. So what do? Do you say that, if 1,000, we take 1,000 this year, do we say that for the next 10 years, there will be no migration? There was nothing there for them. So it's like, what do we do with these? How do we reconcile it with the act? And then so Congress was passing, additional acts and stuff. In 1950s, US also is the strongest nation, the most developed nation in the world. And during Cold War, it is, after Cold War, it started a new policy of becoming friends with these small nations, newly independent nations, who they don't want to be communists. So there is this new relationship, new aid, and one of the US aid is for education. So they're bringing all these people from, Korea, China, India, all these, few people here, and they are studying in higher education. And these people are willing to work here to gain American experience. But the policy and the employers are willing to recruit them, yet the policy doesn't allow them to work for a long time. So 1965 policy, so Congress, in the 1950s and early 60s, makes a few amendments that this year we will allow these people, if they're scientists and stuff, to be here, right? So what we see is a new scientific workforce in USA is built on immigrant labor. We don't talk about that. Think of how many Nobel Prizes have been won by people who are not, for the US, who are not born in the US. These were all people who came as students, as scientists, and they worked with the.
It also causes brain drain in a lot of countries.
And the nation started complaining. They were like, what are you doing? You say you're helping us, but you're taking all our brightest people, right? What we don't realize is the term brain drain was coined by an English sociologist who said we are producing, first, look at the medical care. In 1940s, after the Second World War, US started giving some grants for developing of hospitals, right? And so if you develop hospitals, you need doctors. So initially they bring doctors from within the policy, the 1924 Act, from England and from Germany and from Canada. So in 1950s, England starts complaining, we are producing physicians for to be sent to USA, right? So US is draining our brains. Brain drain is common by an English sociologist. And then there is high investment in specialized education. You need 4 or 5 years. It's not like, you can come tomorrow and you can start digging a railroad or, a ditch or something. You need specialized people. Each nation has they only produce 1,000 or 2,000 diggers. So once the nations that were drained, the Western European nations, then the only labor that is available is from Asian nations, where students are here already highly educated. That's what I work on, so I can talk about this. So they're here already. When I interviewed somebody, these people said, we were working as a trainee in a company, and this person said, somebody asked me, do you want to work in this factory forever? In this, and he said, we didn't know we could do that. And he said, I said yes, and my friend said no. And he said, we had no idea, but the company sponsored us. He said, in 1962, I became I got my green card. And he said, I had no idea. So what he says, we were doing a training work. And so it's like, you see the potential in a training and you recruit that training. Right? So all nations, Western nations, even Canada changed its policy. Its policy was based on national, in some ways, race, where you originated from. Canada didn't want Asians to migrate either. It only wanted Europeans to migrate. But Canada also established changed its policy in 1963 and 1967, very similar to US policy, with one change. It established, their policy is also focused on skilled labor. But what it does, it has established a point system. And it works with the local associations, various organizations, professional organizations. And so the points for a profession keep changing. Let's say you're a computer scientist, and so you will get the maximum 18 points. So if they say, if you get 70 points, don't even hire a lawyer, just apply and you'll get it. Canada right now is one nation which says we need 150,000 people every year, right? So it's like, it's a welcoming society. And they're saying, come. US and England and Germany in some ways are saying, no, don't come, right? Canada in some ways is absolutely different. Canada says, couple of months ago, Canadian minister said we need 150. He came up with a number, we need these many people annually to migrate, right, based on the point system. So what they do is, US in some ways is very complicated because the employer has to say yes. Employer might think, you're working for me. You go after 6 years, I'll get somebody else, right, doing your job. So the wages, salaries will remain lower. Canada is very, very clear. We need workers, and industrial development, a lot of business development is also based on migrants, right? Somebody was even talking about refugees and stuff. In 2015, Central Ohio various refugee organizations came up, did a report, and they said how the city of Columbus is benefiting from these refugees. Refugees have created businesses, have created jobs. Their home ownerships and everything is rising. So this general discourse that, they are a problem is not true. So that report is available. If you want, I can send information to you if you want to read that report. My students in 4,000 class read that report. So I have the link, I can give you that link, right? So US policy in many ways, the discourse is we don't want people. In reality, what we say is labor, skilled and unskilled labor is both needed here. We have this discourse against undocumented people. Undocumented people don't get Social Security. They all work in low paying wages. Nobody wants to work, right? I had somebody who came to my class once. He was from an organization that worked with migrant education. He told my students, he said, okay, 2 of you come up here. And he put them on across, a small classroom. He said, you are picking tomatoes. And he said, the other one will be picking cucumber. You have a basket in your back. And so you have to be on your knees to pick this up. Right? Students just walk a little few steps and they're like, no, we found the black first part. And what he said was, well, how much mechanization you have with big crops, we need people. Right?
Student labor.
Student labor is the word he used. It's student labor. He says, initially, students would do that. He says, how many of you do that now? No, people didn't even know that. Right? And so what I'm trying to say is labor is needed here. So in Canada, the policy is, if you look, sometimes I frequently look at the point system to talk to my students about it. Once there were, it's maybe plumbing is needed, maybe funeral directors, it keeps changing. So it is in sync with the labor market needs. Yes, highly educated people are there. They get, if you have a master's or PhD, you get the maximum point. And then you also have to show a little evidence that you have money. You will not be dependent on the state for, I don't know, whatever number of years, 3 years, 5 years, you cannot. So you have to sustain yourself. Right? The idea is if you're educated, or for any kind of workers, you can get workers. I brought to my class, people from the local organizations who are dependent, who are dependent on H2 workers, agricultural workers, or nursery or other. And they said, we don't have them. They said, we apply for 20, we get 10 approved. So what they say is our business, we have to curtail our business because we don't have workers. So workers are needed, but this discourse, larger discourse, not only in the US, in many nations, has become increasingly anti-immigrant. Right? Immigrants are seen as a source of problems. So in that larger narrative, the climate refugees, although the reading says we shouldn't use that term climate refugees, because we don't think about solutions too much, right? It's people who are violent, who are being displaced and migrating as a result of migrating across borders as a result of climate changes. They are on nobody's radar. Right? Policy initiative, he says, they are just beginning. And then policy initiatives are also limited. Antonio Guterres, the UN head, said the same thing. There is, he says, we've all been numbed by all these crises. We don't think anything. So the solution is it has to be a local solution. It has to be a solution which we start right now, rather than when it becomes a huge problem that we have to, it's beyond our means to control it, right? And what is happening in Bangladesh and Pakistan is the result of, it's not really limited to local, it's local reasons. The problem is global, and we need to think globally. The effects are local, but we need to think globally. Right? We need to have a policy. Industries are slow because there's investment here, right? And the will is limited, but people are beginning to understand as more and more floods are coming, as the hurricanes are becoming stronger and stronger. A few weeks ago, there was a hurricane coming, cyclone, they don't use the word hurricane, coming in Indian Ocean. They said had the strongest hurricane ever, cyclone ever recorded, right? It was going to be whatever numbers were, but it was going to be the strongest ever. So we know hurricanes are much more powerful. So we can see the effects, but we don't make connections between climate change and refugees, right? What happened in Kentucky, a few years ago, last year, I think, tornadoes, floods. Local, we are seeing the effect, but are we making the connection? That's something we need to think about. Right? Thank you so much for your contribution. I didn't know what I was going to say. I hadn't prepared a PowerPoint slide and stuff. You guys helped me so much. So I hope I make sense. Thank you so much.